It was the kind of case that drew attention from every corner of the city. The defendant, a young black man, stood accused of a crime that had divided the community. Some believed he was innocent, others were convinced he was guilty, but everyone in the courtroom could agree on one thing: the trial had sparked an overwhelming amount of tension. The prosecution had come out swinging, and so had the defense. At the heart of the case stood Amina Robinson, a sharp, composed defense attorney with a reputation for brilliance and unwavering tenacity. She was a black woman in a field where such professionals were often rare, and she had earned her place by working harder than anyone else. She had won cases that seemed unwinnable, and no one in the courtroom could deny her legal prowess. But this case was different. The local police force had a personal stake in it. Officer Luke Harrison, a veteran cop with years of experience, was a key witness for the prosecution. His testimony was essential to the case, and the tension between him and Amina was evident. Every time he took the stand, Amina's cross-examinations made him sweat, her questions cutting deep into the credibility of his statements. By the time the trial reached its most heated point, the atmosphere in the courtroom was palpable. It wasn't just about the case anymore, it was about power. Amina could feel the frustration mounting within Harrison as the hours wore on. The more she questioned his integrity, the more hostile his responses became. He was a man used to being in control, used to intimidating those around him. But Amina wasn't like everyone else. She wasn't afraid of him, and she wasn't going to back down. The trial broke for a brief recess. Amina gathered her papers, taking a moment to compose herself. She stepped away from the table, silently reviewing her next steps in the case. As the room began to empty, she didn't notice Harrison lingering near the back of the courtroom, his fists clenched in frustration. He had been on edge the entire trial, but now, in the silence of the recess, he could feel his anger boiling over. With a sudden motion, Harrison stormed toward Amina. His heavy boots echoed in the otherwise quiet room. He had no intention of just talking. His eyes were wild with rage as he crossed the room, each step bringing him closer to Amina. She didn't see him coming until it was almost too late. He was close now, dangerously close. In one swift movement, Harrison lunged toward Amina, reaching for her arm. His fingers closed around her sleeve in a move that was meant to intimidate, to make her feel small, powerless in his presence. But Amina had been trained for this. She had studied self-defense, martial arts, and the art of staying calm under pressure. With a quick pivot of her body, she slipped out of his grip, using her own momentum to spin herself behind him. Before Harrison could react, she used the momentum to her advantage, bringing her knee up into his stomach. The breath left his body with a sudden whoosh, and his face twisted in shock. The moment was electrifying. Harrison stumbled backward, caught completely off guard. The force of her strike had thrown him off balance, but that was just the beginning. Amina wasn't finished. Her training kicked in, and she followed through with calculated precision. She moved like lightning, her body fluid and controlled. She stepped in close, using Harrison's disoriented state to her advantage. Grabbing his arm, she twisted it behind his back, locking it in a firm grip. He gasped in pain as his body was forced to the floor, her knee pressing down on his shoulder to hold him there. The room fell into stunned silence. The sound of Harrison's breathing was the only noise that filled the space. Everyone in the room had been expecting chaos, but no one had anticipated this. Amina, the defense attorney, had just taken down a seasoned police officer with nothing but her skill and composure. For a moment, there was a stunned hush. The judge looked on in disbelief, his gavel hanging loosely in his hand. The other officers in the room were frozen in place, unsure of how to react. They had seen confrontations in the courtroom before, but nothing like this. Amina stood over Harrison, her face impassive. There was no sign of fear in her eyes, no tremble in her voice. She was in complete control. "Get him out of here," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "Now." The bailiff, who had been watching in stunned silence, rushed forward, but hesitated for just a moment, unsure of whether to move. But Amina's stare was unyielding. "Now," she repeated. Two officers approached, still unsure of how to handle the situation. One of them cautiously knelt down to help Harrison up, but he wasn't in any condition to resist. His face was red with humiliation, his pride shattered by a woman half his size who had expertly brought him to the ground. He could only grunt in pain as he was helped to his feet. Amina stepped back, standing tall and proud as the officers escorted Harrison out of the courtroom. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained calm, unfazed. She had just demonstrated more strength and courage than most people could ever hope for. The officers left, and the room remained in silence, the only sound now being the soft rustling of papers as the trial resumed. The judge, still in shock, cleared his throat and regained his composure. "Ms. Robinson," he said, his voice slightly trembling, "please continue." Amina didn't look back as she returned to her seat. She wasn't here to explain herself, she was here to do her job. The case wasn't over. There was still work to be done. The rest of the trial proceeded with a new energy. The jury, the defense, the prosecution, all were aware that something profound had just occurred. The power dynamics in the room had shifted. No longer was it just a battle of legal minds. Now, it was a battle of wills, and Amina had proven hers to be stronger. As the trial continued, Harrison's career began to unravel. News outlets were quick to pick up the story, the headlines screaming about how a police officer had attempted to intimidate a defense attorney, only to be taken down in the blink of an eye. Harrison's reputation, built on years of questionable behavior, was now in tatters. The internal investigation into his actions was swift, and soon, his colleagues were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. His outburst in the courtroom would cost him everything. But Amina's star continued to rise. Her courage in the courtroom made her a hero. The legal community, already aware of her brilliance, now saw her as something more, someone who would never back down, no matter the threat. And when the case was finally decided, Amina won. Her client was acquitted, and the courtroom was filled with applause, though it wasn't just for the verdict. It was for the woman who had stood tall, who had fought back against oppression, who had turned the tables on a system that had long underestimated her. As for Officer Harrison, his career was over. But Amina? She had just begun to make her mark.